I think one of the most interesting things about the two false Columbine martyr myths is that they all come back to the same exact person, Craig Scott. And Craig Scott happened to be the sister of one of the supposed Columbine martyrs, Rachel Scott. Although here's the thing, we're not blaming Craig. We are not blaming teenage Craig for what happened because this all happened out of a genuine misunderstanding. Let me explain. So there's two stories of martyrdom at Columbine. We have Cassie Bernal in the library and then Rachel Scott outside. The story of Cassie is that she's hiding under a table in the library, and one of the shooters comes around and asks her, "Do you believe in God?" She says yes, and he says, "Good, go be with him," and then takes her life. That story comes from Craig Scott, who was hiding underneath the table that was right next to Cassie. Here's the problem. Through eyewitness testimony what happened inside the library, as well as the audio recordings, the 911 call the teacher Patty Nielsen made that captured the entire attack on the library, the whole total slaughter inside the library on a phone call, they were able to determine, and by they I mean the investigators, were able to determine that it wasn't Cassie who was asked this, it was Valine Schnurr who was asked this, and she was asked that after she was shot. Valine Schnurr was shot before she professed her faith. The conversation about her faith happened afterwards. She wasn't shot after that. Now, when you're in horrible situations like this and your adrenaline's running, your eyewitness testimony, the things that you remember can be a little skewed. So we're not knocking Craig. But so many other people remember Cassie's final moments, and they all were able to confirm, yeah, this didn't happen to her, and then the 911 call backs it up. Now, Craig Scott, interestingly enough, was actually the first person in the library, once the assailants left the library to go roam around other parts of the school, to get up and tell everyone that they needed to run. On his way out, he actually helped out an injured Casey Rubsager escape as well. On his way out, he actually passed by the body of his sister Rachel, although he had no idea who she was at the time. He had no idea what he had just walked past. The news and the TV reporters and the media, they're all swarming around Columbine, and they start talking to people who were, escaping the school as they're coming out. And they talk to a young Craig Scott who starts telling the story that they were shooting some girl and they, killed her because she believed in God. And he attributed that to Cassie Bernal. That's where the Cassie story comes from. Hang on to your britches. The Rachel Scott story comes from Richard Castaldo, who was outside eating lunch with Rachel when they were both shot. Rachel lost her life, but Richard was paralyzed from, I believe, the waist down. He still has to use a wheelchair to get around to this day. Richard is rescued, he's taken to the hospital, and he goes through a lot of different surgeries. He's under a lot of anesthesia, he has taken a whole lot of painkillers, and then while he's, coming out of anesthesia, he's under the influence of all these painkillers, which mess with your memory, and you say a whole bunch of shit that's not true, stuff you don't mean. If you've ever seen the videos of people, after they get their wisdom teeth taken out, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now imagine that for if you're having, back surgery and, stuff going on with your spinal cord. And Richard tells his mother that, she was crying and then they shot her because she said she believed in God. Now, that story was never officially told to the investigators. He did not mention that in any interview with them. But Richard's mother did share that with Rachel's family. I've done videos on this before, and I'm going to end up having to make another one again, where we know that Rachel was not whining and crying. She was physically not have been able to do that. That would have been agonal breathing. And people were able to piece together that, there was coverage of Columbine, on the news in Richard's hospital room on the TV, and he was hearing the stories that was being repeated about Cassie, and then he kind of, in his hazed, painkiller, all drugged up medical state, he was able to take that, but he was confusing it with what happened to Rachel. Again, all stemming from Craig Scott, but also, we are not blaming Craig Scott for this. We are blaming him for continuing to perpetrate these lies after all this has happened almost 27 years ago, and he knows the truth, and it has been proven multiple times, but we're not blaming him for how this happened in the first place. Now, the comment that I'm replying to is 100% true. The investigators were able to conclude within the first few weeks after Columbine that Cassie Bernal did not say yes in the Columbine High School library. It was Valine Schnurr. They knew that the story came from Craig, and they went, okay, we gotta get this shit figured out. 1 month and 5 days after Columbine happened, Craig Scott returned to the Columbine High School massacre scene. Obviously, all the bodies had been removed and everyone had been buried at this point. But they opened up the library to both the survivors and then the victims' families, if any of them were able, to get any closure from being there, either, confronting where they had just been when all this horrible stuff had happened, or if they were able, the families, wanted to see where their child, where their loved one was for their final moments. What that also offered was the opportunity for anyone who survived to come back in and kind of fill in any gaps that the investigators may have been missing. And the investigators bring Craig Scott in on May 25th, 1999, and they're having him walk through what's going on. They go, okay, so you were sitting where, and they knew where he was sitting. And he went to the table where he was sitting. And he says, I was sitting under there with Matt and Isaiah, who were two of his friends who lost their lives in the attack. And they said, okay, explain the whole she said yes thing, point, to where you heard it from, all sorts of stuff. And he said, I knew it was Cassie. I know Cassie. I know Cassie's voice. I know specifically it had to be Cassie. And he points to a table clear across the room. And they said that wasn't Cassie. And Craig's like, what do you mean it wasn't Cassie? I know Cassie. I know Cassie's voice. It was Cassie who said it. And Cassie said it from over there. The investigators go, Craig, that was another young girl. Cassie was at the table right next to you. And he goes, what? And they go, yes, which was entirely true. Cassie's body was found where under the table that she was sitting at the table that was directly next to him. Helene Schnurr, the girl who did say yes, was the one who was sitting clear across the room. And all the craziness and insanity and just chaos that was happening, he couldn't figure out from what direction he's heard that conversation of her saying yes. And he also got the whole point about her being killed for her faith being wrong, because Valine was, again, she was asked after she got shot, and she survived. And Craig realizing what happened, number one, I'm sure he was just overwhelmed by being a Columbine, back in the library in the first place, and that, stirred up a lot of emotions, and then realized that he got that big major thing wrong. He turned to the investigators, he excused himself and said, I'll be right back, pardon me. Walks out of the library, walks into the hallway, and barfs everywhere. He just completely tosses his cookies. And I get it. When I get overwhelmed, if I get anxious, I'm going to get nauseous too. But yeah, that's what happened.